So in this lecture, we are going to study measuring GDP using three different approaches. We're also going to study the problem in measuring GDP. Or in other words, we try to understand why GDP is a good measure, but not a perfect measure. So this chapter is about measurement. So why we study measurement? In economics, without the correct measure of our economic data, so everything becomes impossible. So this is because first, macroeconomics produce hypotheses about aggregate policy. Like say, for example, so what's going on with the unemployment or inflation? What are their relationships? What we can do in terms of macro policy? But without a credible measurement of these quantities, meaning the inflation, the unemployment, or the total GDP, as we're going to study today, it is impossible to test the validity of this theory. Like the theory usually we have is, say, for example, there may be some interesting correlation between unemployment and inflation. And finally, economic data are crucial for understanding the state of the economy. And then from there, we can design certain policies to help deal with the problem of our economy. So we are going to start with measuring the GDP. To measure GDP, usually we follow the NIPA account, which stands for national income and the product account. Here, so we have data for GDP growth rate in different regions. We start with the worldwide GDP growth. In 2021, the growth rate is around 6%. This is followed by US, and then the growth rate was close to 6%. Euro area and China, and then so emerging market and some developing country. So in 2022, everything becomes smaller, and why? As everyone knew, is because of the pandemic. Now 2023, so we are going to see some expansion in some region, but not everywhere. Okay. Now, what is GDP? So nominal GDP, by the way, we're going to study the difference between nominal GDP and a real GDP. Let's start with nominal GDP. Nominal GDP is a dollar value of final output produced during a given period of time within the border of the United States. So here, there are a few things I want to highlight. Number one, it is about final output. Okay. So we focus on final output or final goods is to avoid double counting. Number two, this is dollar value. And then number three, this during a given period of time. You can think about it's a year, a quarter, a month. Usually we look at quarterly or annual data. And finally, this is within the border of the US. But here, certainly, we look at US nominal GDP. If you look at other country or other region, and then you're going to look at that particular economy or region's border within the border. Or in other words, GDP is a geographic notion. So GDP is intended to summarize how much economic activity is going during a specific period of time. And so in order to measure GDP, we use NIPA. Again, this is national income and the product account. So this account is going to serve as a conceptual framework for us to organize data on the production of goods and services and on income received by factor of production. And from here, you're going to see, actually it's here, so I already give you some hint. So we can either look at a production or how much we produce, or we can look at income. Okay. So this just refers to three different approaches to look at GDP. So this GDP data or the NIPA account is maintained by US Department of Commerce, just to give you background information. Now these slides kind of emphasize the importance of GDP, or why should we care about GDP. This is what President Kennedy mentioned back in 1968, and so the notion back then is slightly different. And he said the GNP is gross national product. So it's different from GDP. But certainly we have one slide to explain you the difference between GNP and the GDP. He said the GNP tells us everything about America except why we are proud that we are Americans. Or in other words, GNP, or in today's language, GDP, carries lots of information regarding to our country, our economy. So the other way to look at the importance of GDP is by looking at these figures. So what we have here? So here, these figures essentially show you the strong correlation between GDP and poverty. On the horizontal line, we have median income or consumption. Okay. So in other words, so actually this is essentially the per capita GDP. The further right you are, and then so you are in a richer country with higher per capita GDP, meaning so you are going to have higher per capita income and higher per capita consumption. On the vertical line, we have a headcount poverty rate, meaning there's the fraction of people who lives under poverty. And here, so the poverty is defined as $5.50 per day. Okay. And so we have 141 countries and over 600 observations, because we should look at the same country at different time period. And then clearly you can see there's negative correlation, meaning the poorer you are, I mean, in terms of per capita GDP, the lower per capita GDP you have, and then the higher fraction, a bigger fraction of people who live under poverty. So this definition of poverty is just one way to look at it. But you have, so if you in other class, so you're going to see slightly different definitions. So for example, so you have absolute poverty. But in any case, they just show you there's a strong negative correlation between per capita GDP and poverty rate. Now let me explain to you NEPA. And from there, we are going to study how to measure GDP. Right. So in this NEPA account, it provides three equivalent way to think of GDP. You can either look at a product, essentially that's the total production of everyone in the economy, or you look at expenditure. It's just a total expenditure of everyone in the economy. And then finally, you can look at income, which is going to look at the total income of everyone in the economy. To summarize, we can look at production, expenditure, or income. And they must all give the same result. This is by construction, as I'm going to show you later. Except sometimes there may be some measurement error. So what does measurement error means? Just for example, if you look at the temperature, now, so you may the device you have is going to be accurate up to the first digit, right? But then so you may have someone else to have more accurate thermals, and then they're going to have different measurement, right? So that's the measurement error. Now let me use this diagram to show you the three different ways to look at the GDP. And also these diagrams give us a big picture in terms of how we understand the economic activity inside an economy or inside a country. For our complex economy, the first instance we like to do, we just categorize everyone into two groups. One of the two groups, you are either households on the left-hand side, or you are firm. How are they different? So households, oh, by the way, so understand they're different. And furthermore, we are going to see there are two markets. Okay, one is the product market or goods market. The other is factor market. Okay, what is the difference? So product market or goods market essentially is where people is going to trade with goods and service for consumption. On the other hand, factor market. So this is the market where people trade for factors that is used for production. Okay. So in these two markets, the households, firms, they are going to have different roles or they have different objectives. For households, what they're going to do? So they're going to purchase goods and service in this product market. right? And then all the goods are produced by firms. So now you can see, so if you track the activity in this market, you're going to look at consumer expenditure or look at GDP through expenditure. Because in this simplified world, everything we produce must be consumed. So either consumed by households or consumed by firm. But certainly you can expand this discussion by considering the rest of the world, as we did in principle macroeconomics. But the logic the same, or the intuition the same. Now in the other market, so we have factor for production. So it is a factor market. What happened in that market? So firm is going to rent labor, essentially hire labor, rent capital. Okay? And then so maybe it's necessary rent buildings, land from households, use labor, capital, land. The firm can produce goods and services, and go back to here, right? So if we keep track all the economic activity in this market, you're going to get two things. Number one, so you're going to see the households are going to receive compensation from firms. Why they're going to receive compensation? Because households provide labor, provide capital, and then maybe the households own a fraction of the firm. As a matter of fact, so for any economy, eventually the firm is going to be owned by some individual, and the individual will be classified as households. So summarize, households are going to get compensation from firm. Why? Because the households provide all the necessary means to produce goods and services the firm is going to produce. Now, secondly, so all this income from wage, from rent, from dividends, again, so this is a compensation to the resource, the households, lend to firms. Okay, so all this income, all the compensation is going to reflect what the firm has produced, right? And then immediately you can see if we track the activity here, so you're going to get the total income, and also you're going to get the total product, right? Because everything is going to exhaust it here, meaning so all the resource will be used for firms production. And for firms or production, so they must pay back to the owner of those resources, including labor, capital, so on and so forth. So now clearly you can see, so there are three different ways to look at all economic activity. One, which is look at all the goods and service we consume. And secondly, we look at all the income or the compensation the households has received. And then finally, we can look at all the goods we produce. Okay, so they are equivalent. So that's why, so we can look at the GDP through three different approach. Right? Now we can look at a simple example to understand these notions or understand so how we calculate GDP and why these three different approach should give us the same number. Okay. So we are going to start with a fictional island economy. This is a simplification, right? So this simplification help us to understand the key idea, but without any complexity. So in this fictional island economy, we have a coconut producer, a restaurant, a consumer, and a government. So now this is a little bit extension to the diagram here, because in this diagram, we don't have government. Now in this example, we're going to expand a little bit. Now, so we are going to introduce a government. As a matter of fact, later, once we understand this example, so we are going to extend this example one step further by considering import and export, or considering the rest of the world. Now let's see what each player does in this simple economy. Start with coconut producer. Coconut producer owns all the coconut tree or the ways of means of produce coconuts, right? So what they do, they are going to harvest the coconuts that grow on the tree. Now we are going to have a restaurant. What restaurant does? So they buy coconuts from the first players, which is coconut producer, And then they're going to produce coconut soup to his client. And then now you can see, so they're going to put some value added. Okay, so what is value added? So this is the concept. It's going to come out very quickly. Consumer, so they're going to buy coconuts or drinks and work. Now, this is the key. So work. So essentially, consumer is going to work for coconut producer or work for restaurant. But furthermore, you should realize the consumer, some of the consumer will own coconut farms and own restaurants. Now, to close the economy or the model, we are going to have a government. What the government does, so it's provide national defense to protect the island from attacks. Now let's put some number. Coconut producer. They produce 10 million coconuts. Okay, this you can think about this is 1 year or 1 month. It's up to you, but just given a fixed period of time, 10 million. And each is going to sold at $2. Okay. But how these 10 was consumed? Among these 10 million, 6 million will go to a restaurant. And then 4 million will go to consumer. So 6 plus 4 equals 10. So this is going to exhaust all the product. All right. Here, another footnote. So later we are going to extend this model by considering inventory. Meaning, so what happens if the coconut producer fail to sell all their coconuts in the current period, and how we are going to count that, how we're going to calculate GDP, right? For now, let's just simplify. So for all the things they produce will be consumed either by restaurant or by consumer or final consumer. Now we look at restaurant. So what restaurant does, like I said earlier, so they are going to use a coconut to produce, let's go back, to produce coconut soup to its clients, right? So the ingredient they use is coconut, and then so they also need labor. So these coconuts plus labor is going to cook up some coconut soup, and then it's going to sell to their clients. Now I can see the the restaurant is going to sell, or their revenue is going to be 30 million meals. Remember, in order to make these 30 million worth of meals, so they have 6 million coconuts, which costs $12 million. And furthermore, so they need to hire laborers, okay, and pay wage. So this is going to come up soon. Now, what the government does, provide protection from attacks from other allies. In order to provide this necessary national defense or the government spending, the government collects tax. Okay. So where the tax coming from is going to be 4.5 million from firms, meaning coconut producer and restaurant, and 1 million from consumers, like income tax. And finally, consumers, they work for business and the government, and they receive interest. So meaning, so if they just actually, so they will rent capital to either the coconut producer or restaurant, and then also they pay tax. So this is the basic information for this economy. Now we can look at this table. Okay, so this is the first approach. We are going to look at the product approach. Okay. So coconut producer, what coconut producer does. So they have a total tax revenue of 20, which is coming from 10 million. Let's go back. It's coming from 10 million coconuts, each sold at 2, right? So 10 times 2 equal to 20. So they pay a wage of 5 million. So essentially, they hire some laborers. Okay, they pay the wage. Interest on loans. Okay, so essentially, they need some capitals, right? But then, so who's going to own those capitals? Like I said earlier, so it must owned by some consumers, because eventually or firms or business owned by individual or consumer. Right. Now, lastly, the coconut producer pay tax of 1.5 million. All right. So this is coconut producer, is their information. Now we can do the similar things for restaurant. Total revenue of 30, because they sold $30 million of coconut soup. In order to make this 30 million coconut soup, they need to purchase $12 million of coconuts from the coconut producer. They pay wage of 4 million, and they pay a tax of 3 million, right? So as a matter of fact, so the tax 3 plus the tax here 1.5, this add up equal to 4.5. This is what we said here. So 4.5 million tax coming from firms, and then 1 million from consumer. Now, let's look at after tax profit. Okay, coconut producer, they have 30 million, and the restaurant has 11 million. Now let's go back how we can come up with 13 and 11. Start with here. So 20 is revenue, minus 5 is 15. And these two adds up equal to 2, right? So 15 minus 2. Right. So that's going to get in, let me see. Coconut producer. No, so that's a typo, okay? So the correct way to do is, so 20 minus 5 minus 0.5 minus 1.5. Oh, yes, it is correct. So it's going to give you 13, right? So 20 minus 5 is 15. 15 minus 2 equals 13. This gives you 13 after tax profit. But where the profit goes, so actually the profit will pay as a dividend to the owner, and usually it's a consumer. Now we look at restaurant, similarly. So 30 minus 12 minus 4 minus 3. So this gives you a number of 11. Right? So this is the net tax after tax profit for coconut producer and restaurant. Now let's look at government. Government is going to have a tax revenue of 5.5 million. And then so all the tax revenue is going to pay it as a wage, or other way, the best way to think about it is the government hire or recruit some consumer work as military personnel. And then so you these military personnel, they provide national defense or to protect the island from attacks from other islands. Okay. Now, finally, look at consumer. So consumer has wage income 14.5. Where this come from? Okay, let's go back. So 14.5 is coming from 3 sources. Start with here. This is 5 coconut producer. Okay, 5. Now restaurant, wage 4. 5 plus 4 is going to be 9. Okay, second source. Now, third source, which 5.5 coming from government, right? 9 plus 5.5 equal to 14.5, right? So that's 14.5. Remember, so there are 3 sources of wage: coconut producer, restaurant, and the government. Now, interest income. Let's go back again. So interest income. Interest income 0.5 from coconut producer. No interest income from restaurant. Here we just simplify. So the restaurant doesn't need any capital. They only need coconut plus labor to produce soup. No interest income from government, or in other words, the government did not borrow. But in reality, the government borrowed a lot. Like in the US, so the government's borrowing, or the bond, or the total debt the US government has right now is close to 30 trillion US dollar. Now taxes, consumer pay tax of 1 million. So this is something we already specified earlier. And the profit distributed to producer. Remember, there are 2 sources of profit. One, is from coconut producer. The other is restaurant. The first one has 13, the second one has 11, a total of 24. Okay. Now we are ready to look at GDP. So the first approach is going to be a product approach. And this approach is also called value added. What is value added and why we use value added? So value added is the increase in the values of goods as a result of production process. To be precise, value added equal to value of production minus value of intermediate goods. What is intermediate goods? Intermediate goods is the goods that is produced and then used as input to another production process. In our example, the restaurant, they use coconut that was produced by coconut producer to produce coconut soup. And then for restaurant, the coconut is intermediate goods. Okay, and then the coconut soup minus coconut is a value added, right? So this is how we understand. But in terms of coconut producer, so they don't use any intermediate goods, right? Because essentially they only use a tree, and the tree is growing on the land, right? Now, what is GDP? GDP is the sum of value added goods and services across all productive units in the economy. Why we use value added? This is because if we use the goods, the value of goods you produce, maybe we can go back to the earlier one. Okay. So total revenue, that's the value of goods coconut producer produced. This is 20 million worth of coconuts. Now, restaurant, the total revenue is 30 million. That's the value of the coconut soup. If we simply sum these together, 20 is coconut, 30 coconut soup. And then, so there's a double counting. Why? It's because in order to make or produce the $30 million value of coconut soup, you have used 12 million values of coconuts. But this 12 million values of coconuts has already counted in the value of goods produced by coconut producer. So this 12 million has been counted twice. First, it show up in the value produced by coconut producer. And secondly, it show up in the value of the goods produced by the restaurant. Okay, so you can see there's a double counting. Okay, that's going to exaggerate over or significantly overestimate the value of goods and services we produce. That's why we want to look at value added. Okay, so we want to value added. So this is avoid double counting, give us a more precise measure of our GDP. So in terms of this approach, so we have a challenge, which is how we are going to value government's production. Why this is a challenge is because usually government production is not sold at market price. Or in other words, do we have a market for national defense? Not really. Okay. And then, so how we are going to calculate the value added of the government? And the easiest way to do is use the cost of input to production. Or in other words, here we just assume, so government is not for profit and there's no profit. So everything they produce equal to the cost. But certainly it could be the case, so the government is pretty inefficient. So the value of the good they produce is less than the cost of the input. But for now, so we just abstract away from that complexity. Okay, just use the cost of input to approximate the value added of the government. Now we are ready to look at the total GDP for this simple island economy by looking at the value added. Coconut producer, so they grow 10 million coconuts, and each was sold at $2. So then the value is going to be 20. The restaurant, what is the value added? So they sold coconut soup at 30 million, but they used $12 million of coconuts. So then value added is 18. 30 minus 12 equals 18. Government. The government paid 5.5 million wage to provide national defense. And hence, we say the value added of the government equal to 5.5 million. We sum them together equal to 43.5. This is the GDP, but this is the GDP calculated using the product approach. Okay. So this is the first one.
The second approach, which is expenditure approach. In order to use expenditure approach, so we may want to look at this equation. This equation to help us to divide or to understand the expenditure in a very better way. So basically, we are saying the expenditure is going to fall into one of these four categories. Either is a consumption expenditure. This is essentially is consumed by households. Usually, this includes durable goods, like say, for example, refrigerators, cars. Non-durable goods, so for example, so the goods we consume on a daily basis, like food, like waters. And then so you have service. So this is including, say, for example, internet or the streaming service you use. Now, second category is investment expenditure. So this investment usually is refers to what economic activity is conducted in the firm level. Like, say, for example, the firm is going to invest in a new building, invest in some machines, right? But this also includes some investment at household level. Like, say, for example, so you have an investment in a house, right? Now, third category is government expenditure. This is the sum of federal, state, and the local purchase of goods and service. This also includes government investment. And then finally, we have NX. NX is a net export. So this X, which is the export, minus M, which is import. So essentially, this NX is going to track the net value of the goods and the service produced within the border, but consumed by the rest of the world. So this C plus I plus G plus NX, that is the four different category of expenditure. If we can sum them together, or if we have a measuring of each of them, and then so we're going to have a total measure of GDP through spending approach. Now let's see so how we are going to get this number correct. So let's start with the consumption. So here the consumption equal to 38. Now let's see so where this 38 comes from, right? Let's go back. So 38. So remember, so we have four players in this economy, right? So let's back. So look at here. Coconut producer produce 10 million coconuts. Among these, 4 million goes to consumer. Okay, so this is going to count as consumer's expenditure. So 4 times 2 equals 8 million. Now, restaurant, they sell 30 million of meals. Who consume those meals? Consumer. So 30 plus 8 equal to 38. That's how we end up with 38. Right. Well, so before I show you the table, and so just remember, so we also need to look at a government expenditure. So what is the government expenditure? So government collect 4.5 plus 1 million, which is 5.5 millions of tax. And then so this tax is used to purchase national defense. And then certainly the national defense was provided to the economy, right? So hence the government spending is 5.5. That's essentially equal to the revenue or the income the government has generated. Now we go back here. Expenditure. Right. So consumption, again, 38, 30 comes from coconut soup, 8 comes from coconut. Government expenditure, 5.5. So essentially, the government collect 5.5 millions of tax used to purchase national defense. So investment is 0 because here there's no investment. Net export also 0 because there's no trade. So we add these two together, we are going to get 43.5. Now let's just compare to the earlier number we have, 43.5, which is value added, right? So these two are identical. This is by construction. Now we left with the third approach, income approach. So we are going to measure income that people receive. And here, so there are 4 different income. First is wage income. And second, the after-tax profit. And the third, interest income. And then finally, tax income. Now here, I want to emphasize so how we count the tax. Okay, so if you count the tax as income of government, and then you must subtract tax from firm and households. Otherwise, you're going to have a double accounting. Why is going to be a double accounting? So if tax is counted as government income, but you don't subtract tax from firm's profit, and then the tax is going to show up twice, right? So this is going to be double accounting. And this is a similar double accounting issue as we discussed earlier, why we look at value added. So now we look at the income, wage income, 14.5. Now I prefer to go back to the earlier slides where this 14.5 come from. Okay. So let's go back to the table. Table one, wage 5 goes to consumer 5. Wage 4 goes to consumer 4. 5 plus 4 is 9. Wage 5.5. Okay, so government paid, that's going to 14.5. Okay, so 14.5. So that's sorry. Actually, let's show over here. So wage income, okay. Consumers have 14.5 millions of wage income, right? Now we go back to these slides. This is 14.5. After tax profit is going to be similar, right? So essentially, we should look at the profit for each business. Here we have coconut producer, and we have, and whatever else we have. We also have a restaurant, right? So 24. Interest income, 0.5. That's actually coming from coconut producer. And the tax, 4.5. Now we need to be a little bit careful. So 4.5. So where is this 4.5 coming from? So let's go back. 4.5. 4.5. How we get this 4.5? Right. Total tax, 5.5. But why is 4.5? This is because, wait, so spare me with a second. So let's go back here where we are. Right, so taxes 4.5. This is because we need to subtract the tax, the tax of the households, right? So why? Let me just go back again. So let me see. Let's look at a consumer. Because the consumer paid 1 million tax. When we look at consumers' income, we only just say, so these are 14.5, this has income, have tax inside, right? So hence you must subtract this 1 from government. Let's just go back here and it's easier to finalize our discussion. So this 14.5 has a tax. And then you must subtract this tax from the tax income for government. Or alternatively, you can say, so this is after tax income. And then, so this goes to 5.5, right? So we add these 4 different sources of income together. We are going to get the same number, 43.5. This is exactly the same as we had before. So now we need to understand, why do they all give the same number? It's magic? No, it's not magic, right? So I give you some intuition. Now let's just summarize. Total output or value added will eventually sold. Hence, it must show up as an expenditure. And then some may wondering, what happened if they are not sold? If there are some left over, we will pick up that question later. For now, everything you produce will be sold. Hence, total output must equal to total expenditure. On the other hand, what is spent? It must be a income, so what is spent on what output produced? It must show up as income for someone in the economy, or in other words, you must compensate your use of resource that was used to produce the output. So hence, this the spend equal to income, or the production equal to income. So that's why order 3 is going to give you the same number. In these slides, we are going to see the actual GDP for the US economy and how these 4 components looks like. On the right top, this is a consumption. And the consumption is the biggest items in our total expenditure. And over most of the time, it accounts more than 60% and roughly like 70%. And the next one is government purchase. So you can see it's around 20% for most of the time. Next, you have investment. And finally, you have net export. But for the US, most of the time, the net export, particularly after World War II, so let's look at it from here, is negative. Right? So that just means we import more than we export. Now, one thing I want to highlight here is we should look at it here. So this is during World War II. The private consumption collapsed, but then so the public spending increased. This largely is because of the spending in national defense or to fight the war. But the main message come out from this picture is that the consumer spending or consumption is the main source of total expenditure. That expense, later when we talk about economic policy, whenever there's a recession or whenever the economy is in a big fluctuation, what the government trying to do is trying to stimulate the private consumption, or the private consumption becomes the target for the government policy. And these slides show you the US GDP in 2 different time periods. One is 1961 and the other is 2011. First, you can see there's a huge increase. This is almost 30 times if you compare 2011 to 1961. But certainly, this is nominal GDP, meaning many growth coming from the price change. In the second half of this lecture, we will talk about how to calculate real GDP and why we calculate real GDP. Now, in terms of the decomposition, here, this column and this column tell you the percentage. Now, you can see the personal consumption expenditure is pretty high. In 1960, it's 63% around. Now it's 70%. And then, so you have investment. Now, here, so you have a government expenditure. So this roughly stable around 20%. Right. Now, as I said earlier, so we want to do some extension or consider some more realistic case or more complex case. First, I'm going to introduce inventory investment. So this is exactly follow the earlier example we have. Now, suppose the coconut producer produce 30 million instead of 10, but still they sold only 10. what is going to be the GDP now? So there are different ways, but clearly the answer is very simple. It's going to be 43.5 as we did before, and plus 3 times 2, which is 6, equal to 49.5. So you can look at this number, 49.5, through different angles. The first, if we just think about value added, there's clearly the coconut producer has additional 6 million of value added, even though it's not so, but this is what they produce. This is in terms of product. In terms of expenditure, this additional 3 million, and usually we characterize as inventory investment. Or alternatively, you can think about the coconut producer just purchase these 3 million coconuts from themselves. And then we characterize this as investment. But this is a different investment. This is an investment for inventory. Or in other words, they can use for next year or next season, if it is possible. So this is the expenditure approach. Now, in terms of income approach, and then it's clearly, so the income of the household is going to increase because basically you can say these 3 million was sold by themselves is also counted as income. Right? So this is how we get 49.5 through different approach. The key message here is that the unsold stuff usually we characterize as inventory investment. Another way to extend the simple model is by allowing for international trade. Suppose now the restaurant also imports something from other island. In order to make $30 million of coconut soup, they not only get 6 million of coconut from domestic producers, they also import 2 million from other island. It's the same price. You may wonder what's the point? Why not just purchase from the domestic? It could be the case it has different taste or it's different variety. Right? So you can easily come up with some interpretation. But in any case, now let's see so what is going to be the GDP. So simply you need to subtract the value added, so the value of this coconut produced outside. Actually, so this value 2.2 will enter the value, will enter the total revenue of the restaurant. So you need to subtract because this is what's produced outside of the economy. And hence we are going to get 39.5. Well, again, so we can use 3 different approaches to understand how this trade affects our calculation. Let's start with product approach. So product approach, this addition, this import is going to only affect restaurant's value added. Now the restaurant value added will be 30 minus 12. That's 12 coming from the coconut producer, domestic producer. And also you need to subtract 4, which is coconut we import from outside of the country. So hence you're going to have 4 million less value added. This is number 1. In terms of income approach, and so the profit from restaurant is going to reduce by 4. Why? They need 4 million more in order to make the 30 million worth of coconut soup. So hence the income is going to reduce by 4. And then so total GDP is going to reduce by 4. Now, the third approach, which is expenditure approach. The expenditure approach, we need to consider net export. So essentially, so we need to subtract the import from the total expenditure. And hence we are going to get the 39.5. Those are 3 different approaches. It's going to get the same number. But here I explain to you how the inclusion of, in the previous case, inventory investment. And in this case, the inclusion of international trade, how this is going to change the calculation, how we are going to adjust these 3 approaches accordingly. Now we have a sense how we measure GDP. and through different approach, right? Earlier, so when we started the discussion, I emphasized, so GDP is very important. It is important in the sense it's going to help us understand, so what's the economic activity? It is important in the sense, help us keep track of the standard of living. It is important in the sense, it tells us, it's going to give us some information regarding to the poverty. But I want to emphasize, this is the main topic of this slide. GDP is a good measure, an important measure, but there are many problems in measuring GDP and using measured GDP. Okay. This is because the following reason. First, there are many domestic productions, meaning so you are doing some service for yourself, or you just create some value but not show up in GDP. So, for example, if you hire a professional cleaner to clean your apartment or your house, this is going to include in GDP. If you clean your apartment yourself, this is not going to show up in GDP because this is not officially recorded, right? Another way, so since World War II, there's increase in female labor participation. So in that sense, it's going to overestimate the GDP growth. Remember, so if the female was working from home, or sorry, if they just work on domestic, they work on house cleaning, so that's not going to add into the total GDP. The second issue is underground economy. If you pay a babysitter in cash, and usually this is not recorded, and then so this is not going to show up in GDP. On the other hand, so there may be a lot of underground economy like illegal drugs or black market, right? So those are not recorded in GDP. Now, the third issue is that government production is difficult to measure. Why? As we discussed earlier, because government production usually is not sold in the market. We look at the cost of production, but they are not equivalent. And finally, the GDP doesn't tell us the inequality. Because GDP, if you look at the total GDP, this is what we can produce as a country or as an economy, that's in the aggregate. If we look at per capita GDP, so that just tell you the average number. It doesn't tell you there's some poor, some people are super rich. Okay. So in the next slide, kind of use some graph to highlight those issues. And this kind of like informal sector, right? So you just take care of your kids yourself instead of send your kids to a daycare. So this is not recorded. Now these pictures show you someone like volunteer, right? So they produce goods and service, but this is not show up in GDP. And this is just informal sector, just mow your lawn yourself. But instead, you can hire a professional lawn care, right? Now, this just shows the inequality. You can see they're like skyscraper, and here, so you have slums. But the per capita GDP cannot tell you how bad its inequality is. And finally, this is some like a black market. So it may not be. By the way, if we look at here, it's Advil. So this probably is like in India or somewhere. So they just sell this black market, and there's all the economic activity in the black market. Usually they're not recorded, so it's not going to show up in GDP. Now we are going to look at a closely related concept, but it becomes less prominent recently. So this is GNP. But first, what is GNP? GNP stands for Gross National Product. So the difference is the GNP is focused on nationality, and the GDP focused on geographic, like domestic. Their difference can be summarized by this equation: GNP equal to GDP plus NFP. What's NFP? NFP stands for net factor payment. So that's a factor payment to US citizen minus factor payment to foreigners. So that's just going to count the income the American citizen earn abroad. And we need to subtract the income earned by foreigner in the domestic market. Okay. So GMP is going to be output produced by domestically owned factor, this both including capital and the labor. It's different from GDP. GMP is not a geographic notion, but GDP is based on geographic border of a country. GMP is going to add together income paid to nationally owned factors of production, regardless where in the world they are located. Usually, the difference between GDP and the GMP for the US is small, but it may be large for countries with many citizens working abroad. For example, Mexico, they have many migrant workers, or Philippines, they have many migrant workers work abroad, and then they remit money back to domestic back home. So in those cases, the difference is going to be large. To understand the difference between GDP and GMP, I'm going to give you a few examples. Example number one, if a Volvo car plant in Ohio is owned by a Chinese owner, but they hire American workers to produce or to assemble their cars, its profit will be in the GDP of the US, but not in the GMP of the US. It is in the GDP of US is because the factor operates inside United States. Not in GMP is because the factor is owned by Chinese or owned by foreigners. In terms of wage bill, it is in the GDP and in GMP because they hire American worker. And so this production happens inside the United States. Example number two, if a Google office in China is owned by US resident, but the Chinese engineers operate the branches. In this case, the profit are in the GMP, but not in the GDP of the US. Now we still just look at this issue from the point of view of the United States. So similarly, its wage bill is not in the GDP nor in the GMP of the US. It's because everything happens outside the US. Third example, my income is paid by the state of Nebraska because it's a state university. But myself is still a Chinese citizen, so I've had my green card for a decade. So in this case, my income will count in the US GDP, but not in the US GMP. It's going to be in China's GMP, but not in China's GDP. So those are three examples to help you understand the difference between GDP and GMP. Now let's look at a practice questions so that we understand how we use the three-tiered approach to look at GDP and GDP and GMP. So in this example, so assume an economy with a coal producer, steel producer, and some consumers. To simplify, there's no government. In a given year, coal producer produce 15 million tons of coal. Japan using 15 million tons of coal and sell for $5 per ton. Coal producer pays 50 million in wage. Now the second firm, steel producer use 20 million tons of coal as input or purchase $5 per ton. Of these 50 millions coming from domestic and 10 is imported. The steel producer produces 10 million of steel and sells it for $20 per pound. Now finally, so domestic consumers buy 8 million tons of steel and 2 million tons are exported. I mean, so because this was produced this is produced by the steel producer. So this produce 10 million. Okay. The steel producer pay consumer 40 million in wages or profit made by domestic producer are distributed to domestic consumer. Now this question asks you, what's the GDP? Use three different approach with three different approach, and also asks you to determine GNP in the case where the coal producer is owned by foreigners. Now let's look at GDP with three different approach. Let's start with value added or product approach. And then so we basically are going to look at coal producer versus steel producer. Start with coal producer. Coal producer, what's their value added? They make 15 tons of coal and sold at $5 per ton. Hence, their value added is 75 because the coal is coming from nature, right? 75. So this is the value added. This value added produced by the coal producer. Now look at the steel producer. So what they produce, they produce 10 millions of steel and sell for 20. So that's going to 200. But they use some coals. They use 25 millions of coals and 5 per ton, which is 125. 200 minus 125, which is 75. Which is 75. Now, this immediately give us a number of 150 because you would just add these together. So this is the first approach. We call this is the value added of the product approach. Now let's look at the second approach, which is income approach. Right? So what income we have? Essentially, we have wage income, right? So in this case, right? So first wage income is paid by coal producer, 50 million. Now, secondly, let's see what the information we have. Steel producer 25, 5, producer 10, 8, the steel producer pay consumer 40 million in wage, right? So this is wage income, okay, wage income. So wage income is 90. This is number one. Now let's look at other income. The other income is profit. The coal producer, so they sold their coal for 75. They pay 50, hence their profit is going to be 25. Now let's look at steel producer. So they sold their revenue is going to 200. That means 200. This is their coal, right? Minus they're going to pay 40 million for wage. And finally, so how much they need to pay for their import? They're going to pay 125, right? So this is going to give you 35. Now we add these three numbers together. And so again, so it's going to give you 150. So this is income approach. This is the same as value added approach, 150. Oh, now we go to the third approach. Okay, third approach is expenditure approach, right? So expenditure, we have C plus I plus G plus NX, right? Now what is C? C essentially is the final consumption by households. Now, what does the households purchase? They purchase 8 tons of steel, 2 million tons of, so this goes to export, 8 tons of steel. So the cost of steel is 20, right? So hence the C is going to be 162 times 8. 20 times 8. Now, what is the net export? So the net export has two parts. So you have import, right? So you import 10 million tons of coal at 5. So import is going to 50. Right? This is going to subtract. And then net export, so export 2 millions And so 20 per tons, this is going to be 40. So the net export is going to equal to -10. Right? Now, so this is C. This is net export. So 160 minus 10. Okay, so you get 150. Right? So this is through expenditure approach. All these three approaches give us the same number. Now, lastly, let's look at GMP. This is the GMP when co-producer is owned by foreigners. And in this case, we only need subtract the profit because the co-producer, so they pay wage to domestic worker, right? So the only things need to subtract from GDP is the profit. The profit, as we calculated earlier, is going to be 25. So hence the GMP is going to be 150 minus 25 equal to 125. So this is the example. To summarize, we have learned three different approaches to calculate GDP. We also learned the difference between GMP and GDP. Now to close this part, I'm going to show you a case study. So this case study is going to look at gender ratio and the saving rate. So this is a research, actually this here, and maybe we just focus on here. This is a research done by two economists, and their research was published in a very top economic journal back in 2011. What they are trying to understand is the high saving rate in some Eastern Asian country. In those countries, the average saving rate is close to 30%, but in the US, most of the time we have a negative saving rate. So they're trying to understand what explains the high saving rate. Their theory is that this high saving rate can largely explain by the gender ratio, or more precisely in those Eastern Asian countries. So they have a strong preference to son instead of daughter. And over time, so they are going to create some imbalance between male and female. The parents, in order to help those male boys or their boys to success in the marriage market, one thing they are going to do, or they have tried, is to give them some savings. So that explains why the saving rate in those Eastern Asian countries is very, very high. Like, say, for example, they just look at gross national saving in 4 selected countries. China's here, and India. The other 2 is Japan and Korea. And clearly, so the saving rate in China, India is much higher compared to the other country. And as a matter of fact, these are 2 countries who has a stronger preference over some, and they have a much more significant gender inequality, gender imbalance issue. Okay. All right, so I'm going to stop here for this lecture. In the next lecture, we are going to study nominal versus real GDP. And we are going to also study how to measure the labor market.